Lila. And I just encourage folks as you're joining to please maybe introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from, whose traditional territories are you joining from, where are you in the world? It'd be good for me to know and for other folks to know. And we'll get started in a minute. We just want to let a few more people hop on before we jump into everything. Welcome, Angie. Welcome, Bibi, and hello, Daisy. And Maya. Hello, Maya. Hello, Lee and Francis. So many people. Hello, Marina. And thank you for letting us know where you're joining from. We got a good spread so far in terms of where people are in the world. Hello, Alexis from Oaxaca. And I should say I'm joining from the north. I'm joining from traditional territories of the Treaty 7 peoples, the Blackfoot Confederacy, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and so-called Calgary, Alberta, Canada. It's where my family grew up. So I am in the north. Not always there, but I am there at the moment. And hi, Nevada. Familiar face. Oh, great. Hello, Bryn. All right. So as people continue to trickle in, I just want to honor, we have a lot to cover in our first class, in all classes. And I want to honor the folks who were on time. So I'm going to put up the slides and then we're going to get started with kind of going through the schedule of the course, some content, information. And then at the end of class, we always leave time for question and answers and discussion. If you have questions that come up during the lecture or during the kind of presentations, please feel free to put in the chat so you can like let it go of your mind. You don't have to try to remember it, hold it the whole time. I also want to share that Charles is with us, and he is our tech support, and he's also another amazing instructor with Earth Activist Training. And we have, if you haven't already noticed, when you join this class, all the material, all the slides, the presentation recordings, and other resources live in a place called the Mighty Network. It's kind of like the course page. And in your registration, you should have gotten information on that in terms of how to access it. Charles just put the website in the chat, but probably tomorrow or the day after, we're going to post this recording as well as open up all the resources for this week's class in terms of different things on phytoremediation and on bioremediation. And then every week you'll find more and more resources and videos in that place. So it's a good place to be familiar with. And it's also a really good place as kind of people in the course. You can talk to each other. You can send me questions. You can make comments. You can get to know each other and your work. Because we have a lot of folks in this course who are doing incredible work, whether it's on wildfires or environmental justice work. So it's really good to get connected and to kind of make that remediation community a bit bigger. So I will get started just with some slides. So we're all looking at something a bit more visual. Okay. And just give me thumbs up if you can see that. Looks good? Okay. So this is our first class. We were supposed to start this course last week, and I want to thank you all for your patience because it got postponed a week. That's because I had a medical emergency. So I am happy that we're still doing the course. I might be a bit slower than normal today because I'm still recovering. So pardon if I stumble, but I'm really excited that we are all here to talk about bioremediation. And we have some incredible guest speakers coming up in the weeks to come. So just to give you an idea of this course schedule, it's shifted a little bit from what's on the website. Today, we're going to do a quick intro to bioremediation. And we're also going to talk about phytoremediation, which is working with plants. That's going to be today's recording. Next week, we're going to do microremediation, which is working with fungi. And we're going to have a guest speaker, Danielle Stevenson. who's with the Center for Applied Ecological Remediation, really great mycologist. On November 4th, we're going to talk about microbial remediation, and we're going to have an incredible guest speaker from Palestine who's going to talk about his project in Bethlehem, Mohammed Saleh. Then on November 11th, we're going to focus on biochar, which I'm very passionate about. I think it's an incredible remediation tool. And we're going to be joined by Michael Whitman, who will talk more about that. November 18th, we're going to focus on bioremediation and wildfires because that's becoming far more frequent in our world. And we're going to have guest speaker Maya Elson, who is incredible and who's also listening in today. So I'm going to say she's doubly incredible. And then on November 25th, the last class, we're going to talk about how do we design community bioremediation projects. We're going to talk about soil testing. We might get soil testing earlier if I can fit it in, but if we can't, we're going to talk about it as the last class. How do we soil test? How do we figure out what's in the soil, and how do we kind of figure out what contamination is present? And then we're going to end the course with really looking at self-care and community care. So when we're dealing with toxicity and we're dealing with these toxic environments that we're trying to heal and that we're also exposed to and we're also living in, how do we take care of our bodies and our communities? And so we'll be looking at different harm reduction tools, as well as, different medicinal plants and mushrooms and nutrition to really support the body when it comes to toxicity. So that is the schedule for the next 6 weeks. Now, all the classes are recorded. And so if you can't make it or you have to drop off because it's really late where you are, if you wait a few days, it'll show up on the Muddy Network and you can catch it there. As I mentioned, again, we have some great guest speakers that'll be joining in future classes, where they'll speak for about 30, 40 minutes, and then also be able to do question and answer about a variety of different topics. So getting into the juicy stuff, what is bioremediation? So I like to start with kind of the root of bioremediation, which is the word remediare or remedium in Latin. And that means a cure, a remedy, a medicine, an antidote that restores health. The word remediation is also a word that's really co-opted in kind of corporate lingo. There's a whole industry of remediation for oil spills that comes from major companies and can be very violent to the earth. And I think we have to kind of reclaim that and really look at remediation as remedy and as healing and approach it that way. So really looking at it as to remedy and to heal a situation that is very out of balance and very injured or damaged. And when we're talking specifically about bioremediation, I use this definition, which is basically allying, or you could say working with living organisms and systems to detoxify, heal, and regenerate contaminated environments. And that happens by either binding contaminants, so locking them up so they can do less harm, extracting or removing them from soil and water, and or breaking down or transforming contaminants so that they are less harmful. And so we're working with living beings or living systems to do that work. Now, in this course, we focus on 3 main strategies for remediation. First, microbial remediation, that's working with microorganisms. And that is, to me, it doesn't get enough love in the remediation world because you can't see microorganisms the same way you can see a sexy sunflower or an oyster mushroom, but there is incredible capacity when it comes to microorganisms to clean up things from oil, to break down different chemicals, to build and heal and regenerate soil. So we'll be talking more about that in future classes. We look at phytoremediation, which is working with plants to do different kind of healing mechanisms and things. And then we look at mycoremediation, which is working with fungi. So phytoremediation is this week, myco is next week, and then microbial is going to be the week after that. And then I didn't add this, but we're going to also focus on biochar and how to work with biochar specifically to do remediation. Now, why do we do bioremediation? So I'm assuming everybody's here for different reasons and different kind of things that are driving you to want to learn about bioremediation. And some of the common reasons that I hear from people, and also why I do it personally, is we live in a world where we grow food, we want to grow food, we want to grow medicine, and that soil, whether it's in urban areas or rural areas, might have a variety of contaminants that can make us sick. And so learning how to clean up that contamination or finding ways to kind of make that soil safer is important. So when it comes to food security, bioremediation is really critical to that. We also live in a world where, some communities have borne the brunt of environmental injustice. They've had things dumped in terms of toxicity, in proximity to communities, especially, indigenous communities, Black communities, Latino communities have all had to deal with more environmental injustice, low income communities. So there's higher levels of contamination in these communities. And when there's also things like oil spills or other kind of environmental disasters, they don't always get cleaned up the way they should. And so people are kind of inheriting these toxic legacies. And so how do we, again, give some tools to communities to deal with that, to try to reduce that contamination or to protect their water bodies, their traditional territories from some of these environmental pollutants. We also do bioremediation as a form of, reciprocity, of understanding that we live on this planet, we take a lot from this earth. And so how do we actually give back? How do we actually, do good work that heals the land? Instead of just growing things and taking things, how do we actually try to make right some of the wrongs that have been done by this extractive economy and colonialism and capitalism? And bioremediation is a way to do that. It's a way to practice that in a really grounded way. And then finally, disaster response and recovery. And I think folks who live on the West Coast, especially, or in the interior parts of North America, we're seeing really, I guess everywhere in North America, actually, and in lots of parts of the world, we're seeing increases in things like wildfires because of climate change. And with that, anytime we have fires go and kind of intersect with built environment, with communities, we have these toxic events where that becomes toxic ash that can impact people's health and the soil and water. We also see things like floods and hurricanes that can, again, move around contamination and cause spills and cause that to happen. Even in places, a lot of my work in the last 2 years has been really focused on post-war or kind of responses to war contamination in places like Lebanon and Palestine and the Ukraine, because again, war is like the ultimate destroyer of the land in terms of the contamination it leaves behind. And people in those places are looking for ways to heal and to heal the environment so that they can grow food, so that they can, exist in those places in a way that is healthy. So bioremediation offers, not always complete answers and like 100% we're good in all these situations, but it offers us pathways to make things better, to help regenerate and deal with some of the damage and the contamination. Now, a few reality checks before we get into the fun stuff. So with bioremediation, and when I'm talking about bioremediation, I'm talking about kind of community scale bioremediation. It's important to kind of compare that to what we call conventional remediation. So conventional remediation is, there's whole industries and kind of politics and everything that go around conventional remediation. That's where you have companies that will come in, they'll have a contaminated site, and they might dig everything up, excavate all the contaminated soil, and then haul it away and dump it in a landfill. Or they'll take all the contaminated ash and then put it in a toxic waste site or a landfill somewhere else. That's a very common form of conventional remediation called dig and dump, right? Where it's like you take it away, you haul it. Bioremediation can be a lot cheaper than that because you're not moving huge amounts of earth and you're not kind of stashing it in other places that might actually cause contamination to other communities. You're kind of working in what we call in situ. You're working in the place that is actually contaminated. You're not removing it, which is ex situ. So, there's lots of different types of conventional remediation. The most common is dig and dump. It is, again, this idea of like we seem to have infinite places to put contamination when that's not true. And in remediation, we try to really focus on addressing the problem where it is. And as a result, it can be cheaper because we're not dealing with big machines and big chemicals and things like that. But it can also be more labor intensive and take longer. So that's something to understand. Another key thing with bioremediation is that there is no one size fits all. Every remediation kind of choice and activity is site and contaminant specific. So it depends on the area that is damaged and that is contaminated. It depends on why it's contaminated and what is actually there. And that dictates what you do in terms of your healing tools and your healing strategies. And it's really important in this work to not come into it with a dogmatic perspective, to not come in basically saying, I want to put mushrooms on everything, or I want to put a sunflower on everything, and to actually think bigger than that and really ask what the land needs and to consider all the options and make the best choice. So really no one size fits all. We're not doing silver bullets. We're really kind of, going with what is actually needed. Also, an important thing to know is that when we're doing bioremediation, some of the easiest things to remediate is land. If we're dealing with contaminated soil, that's going to be one of the easier ones to work with. Then comes surface water. So if we're dealing with contaminated streams or creeks or runoff, that's also an easier thing to work with. When we get into things like groundwater, that's a lot more difficult given the limitations of community bioremediation and not having like maybe major equipment and machines. And if we're looking at things like oceans, that gets even bigger and more difficult. So for the sake of this course, we focus a lot on land and surface water, kind of first and foremost, because that's what is the most doable, especially if you're just getting started. Now, another key piece, and just as things to remember as you do this work, it's really important to do no harm. There's ways that we can engage with the land and kind of apply treatments that can sometimes tip the balance, not always the right direction. And so you really have to think about that when you're doing bioremediation, especially if you're in more of a wild environment versus a more urban environment. And it's really important that you treat your natural allies well. When we're working with plants and fungi and bacteria, we're working with them. We're not enslaving them. We're not kind of, using them. We're working with them. And they're doing work that we couldn't do, and they're doing it better than we could do it. And so we have a responsibility to also take care of them in that work. It's important to embrace the diversity of solutions in this work. As I said, not to be dogmatic, but to understand that nature is complex and that we are dealing with complicated problems. Every once in a while, you get a really easy bioremediation problem where it's like one metal on your site, that's it. But often we're dealing with layers of contamination or all these different things. And just as that is complex, so are the solutions. And we shouldn't shy away from that. We should embrace it and get creative. Now, a few other reality pieces is that, we need to skill up in order to do this work. We're going to be covering a lot of like introductory information. And if you get really excited about this, it's important to go deeper and really master some of the different skills. And then you do that, then it allows you to scale up the work and to do it in a bigger way. And while bioremediation can be cheaper than conventional remediation, it still requires funding. It still needs funding to buy materials. It still needs funding for things like soil testing. So you have to think through that piece as well. And there are safety considerations. Like we're going to talk about it at the last class, but if you're working around contamination, you have to keep yourself safe. You have to keep your team safe and your community safe because, just because you're doing a good thing and planting things doesn't mean you're not exposing yourself. And so that's something that we have to be really responsible about. Now, one last thing before we start talking about plants, I want to talk about contaminants really quickly. And we're going to return to contaminants. I have a slide deck that I'm going to put in the Mighty Network that just goes through all these different types of contaminants that you might find on different sites and why you might find them, just to help with kind of having a better idea when you do a site assessment. But I didn't want to cover it today because it can make people a bit sad because it's heavy. But in order to do healing work, you have to understand the injury. You have to understand what is causing the problem. So the more you know about contamination, the more you know about contaminants, the better in terms of the work you can do. But just kind of for a bit of an intro, we want to know about contamination because we want to figure what's present on our site. If we know what's on our site, what's in the soil, what's in the water, that allows us to figure out which bioremediation tool we're going to use. And we can get really specific and we can kind of apply like potentially the best option or something that's kind of more likely to succeed. So it is really important to know. It's also important to know how much of that contaminant is there. Does it, is it a lot? Is it, just a little bit above safe levels? What does that mean? And so again, we'll talk a bit more about that in soil testing. But I just wanted to, for the sake of introduction, bring up, 3 different types to kind of keep in your mind. So when we're talking about contamination and what we're trying to address in bioremediation, first kind of classic contaminants that we tend to look at is heavy metals. And so these are things like lead, cadmium, arsenic, chromium, copper, mercury, nickel, barium, antimony, the list goes on. And these heavy metals, especially things like lead, cadmium, arsenic, chromium, copper, these are commonly found, especially in urban areas on sites, depending on kind of, the history of the different communities, what people were using. We used to put lead in everything. Up until the 1970s, it was in gasoline, it was in paint. So when you do soil tests and you find lead very commonly, it kind of goes back to kind of what we used to use lead for. We used to put lead and arsenic in pesticides. So even, orchards in rural areas are going to have lead in their soil, right? And so it's important to understand where some of these metals might come from so that if you're looking at a site, you understand the history, you know what's going to be there. But it's also important to understand that when we're dealing with heavy metals can be extracted, removed from soil or removed from water. They can be immobilized where they become less available to move up into plants, but they cannot be broken down. So you would never, if someone was growing plants where there was heavy metals and then they took those plants and composted those down and then wanted to spread that compost, you would never let that happen because that compost just has heavy metals in it. Heavy metals don't break down. So whenever we're dealing with heavy metals, we're trying to extract them or trying to immobilize them. We're not breaking them down because they don't work that way. And that's also why we find them so many decades later in the soil, right? Now, with chemicals can be extracted and they can be broken down and transformed. And so some of the common chemicals that we hear of often on, different sites are things like PAHs. That stands for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So that comes from, lots of different types of petrochemicals. It also comes when you burn plastic, you get PAHs. We see things like VOCs, volatile organic compounds, that again, petrochemical, plastics, you'll see VOCs, paint thinners can cause that. Different fragrance kind of things all have VOCs in it. And that's very kind of gaseous, volatile organic compounds. They tend to break down a bit quicker than PAHs, but they are carcinogenic. So things like benzene, ethylbenzene, those are VOCs. And then we have things like PCBs, dioxins, and furans. And these are what we call persistent organic pollutants. They're chemicals that just take a really long time to break down, and they tend to bioaccumulate in people and in wildlife. And they come from different pesticides. They're used in a lot of different kind of manufacturing. Dioxins and furans are used in everything from pulp and paper to, again, if you have a wildfire or some kind of explosion, if you have plastic or certain kind of chemicals that burn, you end up with dioxin. And again, it's carcinogenic. It's really not great. And we want to find ways to break it down and get it out of the environment. And then a final chemical I'll mention, there's a lot of different chemicals, but we're just focusing on some of the common classes of chemicals. But another one that's getting a lot of hype right now is PFAS. And these are the kind of persistent fluoro, I can't remember the long kind of name for PFAS, but essentially PFAS is what we call a forever chemical. And there's lots of different kind of breakdowns of it. But this is in anything that's kind of waterproof, like Gore-Tex jackets, for example, in Teflon pans and nonstick pans, a lot of other things. But PFAS, it really stays in the environment. It's in firefighting foam. So if people had to do like a firefight on a house, there's a really high chance there's going to be PFAS potentially in the soil, depending on what they used. And PFAS is really gaining attention because it's really bad for you. And there's not a lot of solutions to dealing with it. And unlike the other chemicals, PFAS doesn't break down. It's very difficult to break it down. So it almost acts like a heavy metal where you try to extract it and accumulate it, but it's a lot more difficult to break it down. So heavy metals and chemicals are the main ones we're going to talk about. I'll also add that excess nutrients is something that bioremediation can do a lot of different things with. So with people who are living in kind of agricultural areas where there might be a lot of manure or fertilizer runoff, you end up with too much nitrogen or phosphorus, and that can end up in your water, in your rivers, in your lakes, and it can cause algal blooms and all these different issues. That is something that there's a lot of things we can do to kind of address that. E. coli, that's another one, again, from like runoff from manure. Those are things that bioremediation, I think it's a bit of an easier lift because those are more natural things, but they're just too high concentration of it, and they're ending up in the wrong places. So those are the main contaminants. So you'll hear me talk about it, go back and forth with some of these. And then again, we'll talk a bit more about it in a future class. So because it's our first class, I wanted to talk about bright things and happy things. And so I wanted to start talking about phytoremediation, just to kind of start with something that people are very familiar with, which is plants, but also talk about all the amazing things that plants can do when it comes to healing the land and how we do that work in particular. This is a photo from Baltimore, from an amazing project in Baltimore that I'll talk about later. But I just wanted to give them a shout out. This is the Risa Renewal Collective, and they do beautiful work. So when we are working with plants, if we're dealing with contamination and we are thinking, hey, maybe we should see if a plant would be helpful to address some of that contamination, there's a few key things to remember with plants. First of all, plants can only clean up contamination as far as their roots can grow. So some contamination, sometimes we're really focused on just cleaning up, a certain level amount of soil where we're going to plant agricultural plants in, and that will work. If you're doing that, phytoremediation can handle that. But we have some examples of contamination, like an old gas station, for example, that have leaking underground storage tanks where you might have deep contamination, like a lot of petrochemicals or, PAHs and VOCs that are deep. And if you plant something like a sunflower up here and down there is where all the contamination is, if their roots can't touch it, they can't clean it up. So in times like that, it's just important to understand it can only address what it can touch, right? Phytoremediation is also good in low to moderate contamination. If you have a site that is so toxic that nothing can grow on it, then likely your phytoremediation plants won't be able to grow either, and you're going to have to modify and do some things to help them grow. And that's actually where we look at things like microbial remediation and maybe starting with microorganisms and some of those strategies first to make that site palatable. But if the site is low to moderate contamination and a plant could grow on it, then you can do phytoremediation on it. Because again, you can't do this work if your plants, your mushrooms, if they die, they need to be alive, right? So you have to have kind of the right environment. A really good thing about working with phytoremediation is they can help keep contamination from leaving a site. So when we cover a bare site with plants, for example, it reduces the amount of runoff and erosion coming from the site. So that in itself is helpful. And then final thing to consider with plants is that when we are dealing with heavy metals, so I already mentioned heavy metals can be immobilized, they can be extracted, they cannot be broken down. So plants are really good. When I'm thinking about phytoremediation, I'm always thinking about, we're using plants to extract metals or to break down chemicals because they're good at doing that. But if they're extracting a heavy metal, they become waste themselves. The plant itself now has heavy metal in it, and then you have to figure out what you're going to do with that plant, right? You can't just be like, yay, it's magic, it transformed. It didn't. Now you have a plant with lead in it instead of a plant with lead in the soil. So we'll talk about that in a few slides. Now, there's different types of phytoremediation. The plants do different things depending on what they're dealing with. So at the root level, depending on the chemicals or metals or what's in the soil, we see a lot of interesting things happening with plants. They can extract different contaminants and pull it up into the plant and kind of store it in the leaves or store it in the roots or store it in kind of the stem or the fruit. We see what we call phytodegradation at the root level, where basically in partnership with microorganisms and fungi, the plants are actually breaking down chemicals at the root level and kind of in what we call the rhizosphere. And then we also see, plants pulling up chemicals, for example, and then actually breaking them down within the plant itself. And again, plants are really interesting because we see the plant and we're like, the plant's doing everything, but it's actually, in some of these cases, microorganisms and fungi that are doing that, but they wouldn't be able to do that if the plant wasn't there. And so there's always, nature doesn't act in kind of these silos, there's always this kind of complementary, we're stronger together vibe. But this is just an example of the different things. Some plants will actually pull up different chemicals and volatilize them. kind of, transpire them into the air, which is not great in a way, but it's better in some situations if you're really focused on the soil, it's moving it out and up. Now, just thinking through, like, if you were going to do phytoremediation, the first step of doing this is you want to figure out what's on your site. You want to see, like, what am I dealing with? Can the site support plants? You want to test the soil to see what's actually there in terms of contamination. When you know that, then you can pick the right plants for the job. And we'll talk a bit more about that. And then you have to prepare and modify your site to support those plants. So maybe you need to bring in compost or, set up irrigation or whatnot to actually make it so that those plants can thrive. Because if they can thrive, the more they thrive, the more they grow, the more they're able to do their work of extraction, of breaking down, and all of that. And then if you're dealing with heavy metals or PFAS, you have to figure out how you're going to dispose of that plant waste. Less of a concern with chemicals, but more of a concern, again, with heavy metals and particularly the chemical PFAS. And then you just plant your plants, you grow them. You might have to do several rounds of it. You might have to do it for one season. You might have to do it for 5. It depends on the level of contamination and whether you're using the right plants. And sometimes people have to play around with that. And then you just kind of keep doing those rounds and pulling things up or breaking things down. You can test in between to see if it worked. And then at a certain point, you can just really, build up soil on your site that's clean and healthy and transition to what you want that site to be, or use a different remediation tool to kind of keep finishing off the work. But that's essentially kind of the quick and dirty of how you would do a phyto application. Now, I wanted to quickly say, so people get really excited when we're looking at, like, what plants can do what. There are certain invasive plants, invasive species that have been found to be good at hyperaccumulating certain things like bamboo, Scotch broom, water hyacinth, but they're also invasive plants in certain areas. And I just, like, we talked about in kind of one of the reality check slides, this concept as a bioremediator, if you don't want to do harm. And so I always say really strongly, do not work with invasive plants. When you are dealing with a contaminated site and a damaged site, think about it almost like its immune system is down and it's very stressed. And if you bring in something that's really voracious and that doesn't play well with others, you're going to really tip the balance, and it's not going to be tipped towards a healthy balance. And so we do not work with invasive plants in bioremediation if we have any ethics and we care about the land. If it's the apocalypse and that's all you got, go for it. But we're not there yet. So please don't do that. There's so many other plants to work with. Ideally, we want folks to work with local species and native species or cultivated species that might not be native to that place, but have shown that they're not going to take over everything and become a problem. So no invasives, no using that. So I want to talk quickly about chemicals, because we're going to talk about chemicals in plants, and then we're going to talk about heavy metals in plants. So some of the easiest applications of plants when it comes to breaking down chemicals are working with cover crops or nitrogen fixing plants. And we know some of those really easily from if you do any kind of farming or urban gardening or anything like that. A lot of our nitrogen fixers like clover, like alfalfa, vetch, things like that are really good when it comes to breaking down certain chemicals like PAHs and VOCs. And even in some cases like alfalfa, they can break down like TNT, which is an explosive. And there's been some really good research on that. And so even if, you don't have a lot of time and you just want to plant like a really beautiful nitrogen fixing cover crop because you got some, chemicals in the soil, it's not a bad thing to do, because it'll kind of do some remediation. It'll help break down certain things. And this is a really good example of microorganisms and plants doing this work, because all of these nitrogen fixing plants are able to break down certain chemicals because of the nitrogen fixing bacteria on their roots. And it's kind of that bacteria that's doing the work, but it's there because the plants are there. So really, really good when it comes to, again, PAHs and VOCs, working with different nitrogen fixers. There's even trees that are nitrogen fixers, like alder, for example, right? So it's not just any old cover crop. It's like a nitrogen fixing cover crop can do really good work on different chemicals. We also know that when we plant cover crops, it can increase the population of earthworms in an area by 3 to 4 times. And earthworms are remediation superstars because they tunnel through the earth and they aerate the earth, which in itself can help break down certain chemicals. They also absorb chemicals into their own and metals into their own body. But most importantly, earthworms have a very specific bacteria in their gut called Pseudomonas florensis. And when they're going through the soil, they kind of leave it everywhere. They poop everywhere. It comes out in their poop. And then it inoculates the soil with this really amazing bacteria that is also incredible at breaking down things like PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and volatile organic compounds. So if you are planting nitrogen fixers, especially certain things like clover, and again, alfalfa and vetch, you're also stimulating earthworm populations. You're also covering the ground, and that's doing a certain amount of good anyway with healing. And you're doing this, remediation when it comes to chemicals. There are also, I will say, alfalfa as a cover crop is not only a nitrogen fixer, but it has also been shown to help hyperaccumulate lead. So if you had chemicals and lead on your site, you could work with alfalfa and kind of do a bit of both. Now, a few other plants that are chemical superstars when it comes to pulling up chemicals and helping break them down. Red mulberry is a really amazing plant. And that breakdown, so red mulberry has a very specific bacteria, again, in its root system that helps break down polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and volatile organic compounds. So that's a really fun one to work with. And then squash and pumpkin and zucchini have a lot of potential when it comes to kind of absorbing and extracting dioxin and PCBs. So if you had soil that had a lot of dioxin in it, you might want to be careful about eating, things like zucchini, pumpkin, and squash, but you could also use them as a way to extract that. And what we have found with things like zucchini and squash and pumpkin is that dioxin and PCBs tend to concentrate in the stems and the leaves and the tendrils, not so much in the fruit. But one of the critical things to always know is that if you have enough of a contaminant in the soil, even if you have a plant that normally wouldn't kind of get to the fruit of that plant, it still might if there's enough of it. So, I would not eat those actual zucchini, but you could use them as a way to deal with dioxin. Another great plant for chemicals is hemp. Hemp is not just good for chemicals, it's also good for heavy metals, but hemp has been shown to be really good for things like PFAS, actually extracting PFAS from the soil, good at PAHs and a whole bunch of heavy metals in terms of being able to pull it up. And it's a very hardy plant. And then we have some really common trees like willow and poplar who have been really, really studied and again, shown that they're really good when it comes to hydrocarbons and volatile organic compounds and being able to pull those up and get them out of the soil. So, when it comes to chemicals, there's a lot of examples of local versions and varieties of poplars and willows, and finding out what that is, where you are, is a good start, and working with them. And I'll also say, whenever you're dealing with trees, they also have deeper root systems, so they can kind of get a bit deeper contamination. So moving from chemicals to metals. So when you have heavy metals in the soil, plants are, I would say, one of the best things to work with when it comes to extracting heavy metals. I would always work with plants for extracting heavy metals over mushrooms, for example, just because they're easier to do it, and they're just a bit more reliable in certain ways at being able to get the heavy metals out. Not all plants are good at pulling up heavy metals. So there is a particular type of plant that we call a hyperaccumulator plant. And these are the plants that are just, through testing and different things, they are able to extract much more kind of contaminants and much more heavy metals than other plants. And they can also survive in a bit more toxic environment because they're able to do that. So just a few examples on the screen. On the left, the upper left, that little yellow flower is like one of the hyperaccumulator superstars, brown mustard. It's really good at extracting a whole variety of different metals. Below that, the white flower is alpine pennycress, and that's one of the most effective plants for extracting lead. Everybody wants to have sunflowers for everything when it comes to lead, but actually alpine pennycress is one of the best plants to do it. It's just not as sexy as a sunflower because it's short, which is so sad, but it's really good at what it does. In the middle is ferns. So arsenic in particular, the heavy metal arsenic, the ladder break fern, the kind of groupings of ladder break ferns are really good when it comes to pulling up arsenic. So if you have a site and it has some shade, partial shade, you can work with that. Even common herbs that we know and that we sometimes use for medicine, like yarrow, are hyperaccumulator plants. Nettle would be another one to kind of watch out for. And then, of course, sunflowers, really good at hyperaccumulating a variety of different metals. There's been lots and lots of research and different studies that have been done on sunflowers, everything from dealing with radiation to, lead and that. So sunflowers do great things. And willow, again, willow and poplar are both good at dealing with chemicals and can also hyperaccumulate different metals as well. Now, when we are looking at extracting heavy metals, a few things to think about with your plants. So ideally, you want plants that are fast growing and that have a high biomass, which means they have a lot of leaf and kind of like a good head of hair. They have a lot of volume, because again, that allows them to really pull things out of the soil. And if they have an extensive root system, that's also really helpful. We need for extraction, some plants can kind of pull heavy metals, but they'll kind of leave it in the roots, which makes it really hard to get it out of the soil. So our hyperaccumulator plants that are the better ones will actually pull those metals into what we call the aerial parts of the plant. They'll hyperaccumulate it in the shoots and the leaves, the stems, more than in the roots. That gets it kind of easier to get it out, although we can pull plants out by the roots. That's not too difficult, but we want more of it to kind of get up into the plant. And again, we want these plants to be able to take up large quantities of the heavy metal without succumbing to its toxic effects. Because there are some plants that they tested in the lab and they go, this is a great plant. And then they put it on a toxic site and it can't handle a certain quantity of that. So you kind of need a plant that can really pull things up and also can really deal with the toxicity and survive that. Now, we'll talk about pH, soil pH. You have to work with the pH of the soil when you're doing any extraction work. And I'll explain that in a second. You have to figure out if you're dealing with heavy metals in plants, how will you dispose of the plants? And then also be open to experimenting with different species. So maybe you're trying, mustard as your first time, and then you're trying something like sunflower, or you're trying different varieties of the same plant. One of the phytoremediation projects that I know of, they tried different varieties of sunflower and they saw a very big difference between the varieties in terms of one that was better than the other. So just keep an open mind and be, willing to experiment. And then saving your seeds. If you have plants that you are working with that are really growing well in toxicity, they're doing a good job after you test the soil of pulling up heavy metals, save the seed of those plants and start building kind of a remediation seed library, right? Because those are helpful things to work with. Now, I mentioned pH. So I try not to make things too complicated and scientific, or this is one of the moments where we get a little scientific. When we are dealing with heavy metals and trying to extract them from the soil, we need to understand that there's two different types of metals. There's cationic metals and anionic metals. And this is only important because it makes a difference in terms of how easy it is to either pull it out of the soil or try to lock it in. So cationic metals are things like lead, cadmium, copper, mercury, and zinc. And when you have soil that is more acidic, so it has a pH that is lower than 7, cationic metals are more mobile, which means they're easier to take up into a plant. They're moving, they're more mobile. So if you were to plant plants that in soil that was more acidic and had lead or cadmium, it would be easier to extract that metal if that was what you were dealing with. However, if the soil is more alkaline, so it has a pH higher than 7, cationic metals are more immobilized and they are harder to move. So then in a situation like that, you could amend the soil, or you might decide maybe extraction is not a good idea and I'm going to try to immobilize this instead, which we'll talk about more with kind of when we're talking about microbial strategies. But it's important to know the pH, and that is a really cheap and easy test to do. Now, awkwardly, anionic metals are the opposite of that. Anionic metals are things like arsenic and chromium. And when it is a alkaline pH, they are more mobile. So while lead, which is a cationic metal, gets immobilized when things are alkaline, arsenic and chromium are more available and easier to pull up, and also more easily kind of taken up into plants. And so the awkward thing is we have a lot of sites because of the types of products we use and the types of pollution in the past, where you often have lead, arsenic, chromium, cadmium, for example, on the same site. And so in the situation like that, it's important to know the pH and to kind of work with what the soil is giving you in terms of which one you're going to go for first. Because you don't want to fight the soil, because it's already hard enough to pull some of these heavy metals out. So this is an important thing to remember. Yeah, so I hope that made sense. We'll cover it a bit more in future classes. Now, this is just a quick list, and it's not an extensive list, but this is just a few examples of different plants that are good with different heavy metals in terms of taking them up. And there's something that happens a lot of times. You'll hear people say, this plant is good for this heavy metal. You should always check that. So don't check it on AI. Don't ask ChatGPT. I have to say, when people ask ChatGPT about phytoremediation, the amount of wrong answers, it's so high. I've seen it so many times. But actually Google, that plant and a metal, and that plant and a contaminant, and you might see different scientific papers that come up, and actually see if it's true, because there's sometimes people just say it, but it's actually not validated. But these are all plants that have been tested a lot and have shown consistently that they are good remediators. And you'll notice that a lot of these plants are not necessarily native plants or local plants. They are, common plants in some places. Things like alfalfa and sunflowers and poplar have gotten a lot of testing. Brown mustard has gotten a lot of testing. But again, you can find local varieties of that where you are, and that might be a good place to start if you really don't want to use something that doesn't come from your area. Now, I'll also say there hasn't been a lot of research when it comes to hyperaccumulators and certain local plants. So I've been working in different parts of northern Canada, and I can tell you there's amazing plants up there that no one has ever looked at to say, is this a good hyperaccumulator? And the only way we're going to find out is we have to try, and then we have to test it, right? And that's how we kind of build out that knowledge. But just because it's not on the list doesn't mean it's not good. It just means that it hasn't maybe had enough studies or testing done on it. But again, you'll see certain things like sunflowers, brown mustard, alder, horsetail, like marigolds, like come up quite often. And I would add hemp to almost all of this when it comes to the heavy metals. In addition, I'll say when it comes to accumulating heavy metals, there's certain families of plants that seem to be better at it than others. So the Lamiaceae family, that's like mint and sage family, the legume family, Fabaceae, the figwort family, the aster or sunflower family, the spurge family, and then the brassicas. So our mustards, our cabbage. I will say brassicas are some of the best hyperaccumulators or most consistent ones when it comes to pulling things out. So if you have a local type of mustard or a local type of cabbage or something like that, or collard or kale, that could be something to work with. And it also might be something you want to avoid eating if you have contamination, because they're pretty good at sucking things up. And just again, a few more plants, mullein. Mullein pretty common, good at accumulating cadmium and copper. Marigolds are pretty good when it comes to things like chromium and lead, copper and zinc. Calendula, which is a common herb, pretty good at lead, strangely enough, and cadmium. Mugwort, again, for the herbal people who love the dreams, really good when it came to zinc and cadmium absorption. So again, you can work with these plants for healing. If these are also plants that you're taking for your own healing, you might want to make sure you source them from places that are not contaminated. Now, again, with native plants and kind of plants in your bioregion, in your locality, if you're interested in working with them, again, I don't want anyone to come at it dogmatically and just be like, if it's local, that's the way to go. It's not always the way to go. Sometimes there are tried, tested, and true plants that will work faster, and you might want to start with those. But again, there's not enough research, and there might be incredible local plants, and you won't have to add irrigation and do all these things to keep them alive. And so just a few helpful things. If you're looking at the plants around you, wondering if they could help, do you know any local nitrogen fixing plants? Like there's different plants, like where I come from, buffalo berry is a nitrogen fixing bush, something like that. Do you know different nitrogen fixing plants and grasses and bushes and trees? Because if they are local and they can fix nitrogen, and then they actually may be good at breaking down certain chemicals. So you could consider that for your project if you had those chemicals. If you have certain species that are local mustards, might not be brown mustard, but it might be another type of mustard that's more local to your area, or local brassicas, or a specific local sunflower that's from the area. You could work with that because they're similar to some of these species that we've tested and that we know are good. They may be better than some of the cultivated species. They may be slower. It depends. And also, what native plants are you seeing that are showing up in very disturbed and polluted spaces? Because that is the earth responding, right? Now, just because you see a plant in a polluted space doesn't mean it's a hyperaccumulator. It just might be tolerant to pollution. It might just be able to live amongst it. Doesn't mean it's sucking it up and trying to suck the poison out, but it's still a good indicator to say, maybe I want to try this, right? And then finally, I'll say, if you're working with local plants, making sure that they are fast growing and they have lots of biomass. Because sometimes we have these really great local plants, but they're slow growing and they're small and they're beautiful, but they're slow and low. And that might not be the best plant to work with in phytoremediation. But if you have any kind of more voracious local plants, that would be a good place to start. So that's just to kind of, if you need to look locally and be like, what can I work with? Just consider some of those questions and those parameters and get creative. Now, one other quick thing I wanted to mention, when we are talking about hyperaccumulation, and also when we're talking about things like food safety in plants, there's this concept called fate of transport. And fate of transport basically just refers to where different contaminants end up in the plant. So for example, different contaminants will move differently. So lead, for example, does not move easily into things. When people deal with lead contamination, it tends to be kind of accumulated more in the roots and the leaves of a plant. But more often than not, it's actually physically, it's lead dust from the soil that's coating the plant, because lead doesn't kind of move quickly and easily, whereas cadmium as a metal does. So a really good example of this is sometimes people grow sunflowers for remediation, but then they're worried about the sunflower head and birds eating the seeds and whether those seeds are toxic. And what different research has found, looking at the fate of transport of these different contaminants, aka where they end up, is if you have lead in the soil, the lead won't get to the sunflower seed. But if you have cadmium in the soil, it will, because cadmium is a quicker moving metal. So it's important to know some of these things, especially if you have a setting where you might be worried about wildlife or children or something like that. And also looking at food safety, you can look very specifically and look up research, but some of the common rules is that the most polluted parts of a plant, if it's grown in contaminated soil, is going to be the roots. So if you're growing things like potatoes and carrots, that's kind of a danger zone. I wouldn't eat that. And then contaminants kind of go from the roots to the leaves. And so if you're kind of looking at things like root vegetables and leafy greens, those are often where the most contamination is. And then kind of fruiting vegetables and then berries and things like that tend to have less, unless there's extreme levels of pollution. And then we move into things like trees and fruit crops that might have even less. But again, it really depends on the contaminant. It depends on the soil conditions in terms of the acidity or the alkalinity of the soil and the plant that you're growing. So something to just keep in mind. A really good example of this is Mohammed Saleh, who you're going to hear from on November 4th, who's an amazing bioremediator from Palestine. He was telling me in one of his sites, they were finding milk thistle everywhere. And milk thistle, for the herbalists know this, really good at regenerating the liver, supporting the liver. And if you're in very toxic environments, you need help with your liver. And so Mohammed was finding this everywhere, saying, can we eat the seeds of this? Is it safe? And the soil that he's dealing with might have a variety of metals, different chemicals from like tear gas and things like that. And so we kind of looked into the fate of transport. And what we found is that milk thistle, the seeds will have, if you're worried, if you have copper in the soil, you might not want to have it. But if you're worried about something like lead and cadmium, it's okay. They don't really get up into the seeds. So that's why this understanding of fate of transport is important, especially if you're like, can I eat the thing? But again, I'll also say, when we start talking about microbial remediation and also biochar, there's a lot of things that we can do to the soil that will help us immobilize contamination if we don't want things moving up. But if we do want them moving up, then it's, again, good to know where it's ending up in the plant and what part of the plant to dispose or to make sure the wildlife don't eat. Now, I mentioned this with hyperaccumulation. When you use plants and you use hyperaccumulator plants to pull up heavy metals, the plants themselves become potentially toxic, right? They have metals in them. And there is no good answer. Everybody always wants to know, what do you do with the plants that have the heavy metals in them? Where do you take them? What do you do with them? And it's kind of like heavy metals themselves are just bad to deal with. Usually the most common thing that people do is they pull the plants out or they cut them down, they bag them up, and they take it to the landfill. If it's a really toxic site, they might have to take it to a toxic waste facility. But if it's just like kind of, moderate, they might end up taking that to a landfill. Or if they live in an area where that's the only option. And that might not sound great to some folks because it's still something's going to the landfill. But if you compare it to the conventional method, which would take the whole site, dig up huge amounts of earth, like just excavate all the earth by the tonnage and bring it to different landfills. Instead, you're bringing a few bags of something to the landfill. So it's a way smaller volume. So that is like one of the ways that people deal with it. Some folks have talked about incinerating it, which has its own problems in terms of some of the residues and pollution. There's also, folks who've looked at basically composting it down and like mixing that compost with biochar or something like that to further immobilize, and not taking that compost and spreading it on like a vegetable garden or anything like that, but maybe feeding that compost to long-lived trees and something that it's not going to be edible, right? So it's kind of understanding that you're dealing with toxicity. You've taken what was 90% of your site and condensed it to 10%. And you still have to kind of watch that and deal with it. One of the remediators I know likes to take the plant waste and kind of turn it almost into kind of like a liquid sludge and then dispose of it that way. I've seen people use worms to kind of break it down and further decrease its mass. But basically, if you're dealing with metals, you still end up with something. Like you do end up with a waste product. It's just a lot less than, the whole site being landfilled, essentially. I will say that there's incredible technology, like in labs and in different places, like in Japan and Korea, where they do have the ability to actually extract the metal from the plant. And they can do that. And ideally we could get there, but that's not something that's available to people at the community level. But there is this thing around kind of like using plants to almost, do something called phytomining, or finding ways to take this plant waste and actually extract the metal from it. It's just not something that you might have accessible at a local university or in your community group. So that's more of a future consideration. Now, I just wanted to say quick example, lead. So I was talking about how lead does not like to move. It's one of those metals that it kind of tends to stick around in the soil. It does the bulk of its damage by actually covering things with soil dust and kind of getting on everything. And not a lot of plants can really effectively pull lead out of the soil. Alpine pennycress can, brown mustard and sunflowers are pretty okay at it. But what we've seen folks do with lead is that some folks will try to pull it out of the soil. They'll try to phytoextract it, and they'll get what they can, and then they'll turn around and try to immobilize the rest. Because lead doesn't move very easily, they'll try to find ways to kind of make it less available by working with pH or adding things like compost and biochar and some of these microbial remediation strategies that are really, really good at immobilizing. Even adding a really neat thing when it comes to lead, adding phosphorus to lead contaminated soil the phosphorus can actually interact with the lead and make it even less bioavailable by forming a different compound called lead pyramorphite. So it hasn't broken anything down. It's just kind of made a bit of a different structure and made it less mobile and less able to get up into plants and things like that. So it's always a bit of a decision of, do you want to use plants to pull something up? Will it happen in a good enough time frame? Will it be easy in terms of, you got the right plant for the job? Or do you want to actually say, it's going to be difficult, the pH isn't aligned, this is a difficult metal to work with, and instead we're going to try to lock it down and do things that are about safety instead. So that's always a choice folks make, and sometimes they do both. They start with one and they end with the other. I wasn't going to use the slide, but it's in here still. So if you're working with lead, just because lead is a common one with heavy metals and with plants especially, just a few things to consider. You have to protect yourself in terms of the dust is the worst thing. It gets on your hands, it gets on your clothes. You want to wear a face mask, you want to wear gloves, and you want to locate things like veggie gardens away from the house and away from older structures and away from the roads, because that's where you have your highest amount of lead concentrated. You want to try to cover the soil, first of all, because you don't want that lead splashing around, moving on air, getting tracked around. And then again, you want to plant your plants and work with those plants that are good at pulling up lead. And if you kind of get to a point where that's kind of, you feel good and done with that, that's also when you want to do kind of raised beds, keep building your soil up and kind of lock what's there kind of down. So lead is one of the easier things to work with. It's also something that's very common in terms of there's a lot of it. But again, plants are good in some ways, but they can be a bit slow for lead. And I just wanted to share a few examples of phyto projects. Like I mentioned, in Baltimore, there's the RISA Renewal Project, and they were dealing with lead and I think a few other metals on this one site. They initially started with brown mustard as their plant that they were working with. But what happened is they had this nice field of brown mustard, and then the city thought it was just a weed field and they mowed it down, which is not what you want to have happen, because that just kind of stops your remediation in the tracks. So what they decided to do was to actually find a plant that they felt could hold the space more. And they ended up with sunflowers. I tend to try to discourage people from always using sunflowers, but sunflowers are really versatile and they tend to captivate people. And so they ended up using sunflowers. They did different kind of spirals and all these different kind of things. And they really got people excited about the space. I think people found it to be really beautiful. They did murals and a lot of other things. And they were the group I was talking about where they partnered with the university and they were testing. So they were testing the soil, but when they would finish kind of their crop for the season, they also were able to test the plants. And that's something that is really expensive, but if you partner with a university, you can sometimes get that in a good way. But they were able to see, which varieties of sunflowers, for example, were more effective at pulling up the lead. And they found, I think it was like a black-seeded sunflower was the type that was working better than kind of another species they were working with. So again, even within a plant, the different varieties, there can be differences in who's kind of up for the challenge. We're going to hear more from Mohammed on November 4th, but the project in Bethlehem is called Ardawa, and it's another example where, they use sunflowers to deal with some of the contaminants and also to really hold the space. So that's one of the things people get excited about phytoremediation, because it can look beautiful, and it can really kind of get people excited because they can see what's happening. And even when you're working with things like cover crops, that can look beautiful too, or if you're working with different trees and things like that. But this is just an example of kind of what that looks like. Now, I mentioned PFAS earlier, and again, PFAS, nasty, nasty, nasty chemical. And it's a chemical that acts like a metal in the sense that it is like everybody's throwing money at it in terms of trying to figure out how to break it down. And it is incredibly difficult. If I don't want to say impossible, but they haven't figured it out yet in terms of how to break it down properly. But there's a project in Maine that is kind of a partnership with the Mi'kmaq Nation and an NGO called Upland Grassroots, that they basically inherited, the Mi'kmaq Nation kind of had a land back moment, got this Air Force base, the Loring Air Force Base back, which was their kind of, territory. But they got this Air Force base back that was heavily contaminated with PFAS. And, then they were like, what do we do with that? Like, it was really badly contaminated. And so there was this project that came together that was looking at using hemp to try to pull up the PFAS. And, different folks from the nation, Upland Grassroots, were working with a university to kind of help do this work and test it. And what was interesting is it was a really difficult project in the sense that they couldn't even water the hemp with water on site because the water on site was contaminated with PFAS. And it's because they'd been testing kind of firefighting equipment. The Army had been testing that in that area and they contaminated it. But what they did find is that the hemp was pulling up the PFAS and doing a pretty good job at it. But kind of where they got stuck is it was pulling up the PFAS, but it wasn't breaking it down. And so then you end up with this kind of hemp contaminated with PFAS. And they kind of sent it to different universities and to different folks to kind of be like, what can you figure out? What do you do with it now? Is there a way that we can kind of further break it down, or, because it's not really a solution if you can't really go that extra step. But they were at least having good results with the extraction piece and trying to figure out kind of what could they do to make that a bit of a healthier space. So it's definitely a cool project to look up. Also want to share an interesting project in Holland, and it's called the Parc de Souval. And it's an interesting project because there was some neat research where this is a site that was a waste incineration plant and a shipyard. And if you want to talk about like two site uses that is going to give you a whole bunch of metals and chemicals, that would be that, right? In terms of ships and cargo, anything where there's waste incineration, you're going to have PAHs and dioxins and things like that. And again, all these different heavy metals. And so they partnered with a university in Belgium. And they were looking at a few different types of phytoremediation. They were looking at kind of just using monocultures, like just one type of plant to try to pull up, extract different contaminants. And then they were also looking at these kind of polycultures, of these kind of meadow plantings of working with different plants that were doing more of a rhizosphere, like kind of remediation in the root zone, probably looking more at chemicals for that. So they worked with plants, they worked with grasses, they worked with perennials, different coppice and things like that. So they did some cool stuff. But what I found really interesting, and it might be hard for y'all to read this. So again, when you have the slides, it'll be easier. And you can go to their website and they go through all of this. But they did research where they looked at all these different plants that they tried on different metals to see which one was better. Because again, those lists that I gave you where they're like, all these plants are good for lead, all these plants are good for cadmium, they're not all equally good. Like some are a lot better than others. And so what they found, for example, with cadmium is marigold outperformed all the other plants, which is interesting. What they found with lead was that field mustard was the best, followed by, marigold and red clover, interestingly enough, right? So again, another example of like a nitrogen fixer like red clover, alfalfa, that are both good at chemicals and hyperaccumulating heavy metals. But they found things like, other species that didn't do as well. So if you have universities that are willing to kind of look at some of this, it can give you that, again, more targeted approach. And then when they looked at, again, this rhizosphere, looking at some of the chemical breakdown, they planted these polycultures of fireweed and cattail, yarrow and willow and a few other things. And that was all about really stimulating kind of a phytomicrobial fungi rhizosphere to really help kind of break down different chemicals. And so they had some interesting results with that as well. Now, final few slides before we get to questions. Most of the thing we've been talking about with plants is focused on soil, but plants are also really good when it comes to filtration. And we know that because nature already does that with things like riparian zones, with things like, wetlands. But there's some interesting ways to kind of adapt some of that work. And so one of the ways that people have kind of done phytofiltration or phytoremediation in things like ponds or, creeks or lakes has been the concept of floating islands. And this is where you basically create these living rafts with aquatic species of, kind of marshy wetland plants. And the key piece with that is you have them floating in water that's contaminated, and their roots are able to kind of pull up some of that contamination. And again, this is another example of it's not just plants, it's plants and secret hero bacteria and microbial stuff. Because if you look at the picture on the right, you can see that's an example of like a floating island. And the root mass, that's like everything that's under the water. Not only are the roots extracting, but on that root mass, microorganisms that are called biofilm will form, and they actually help break down different chemicals. So it's kind of, again, micro and phyto at the same time. And this can be used in lakes. This can be used in, ponds, things like that. Really good if you're dealing with things like eutrophication. So if you have a situation where there's too much phosphorus or nitrogen that's ending up in the water, if you add some of these and you also add like pumps to kind of help with oxygen, that can help, again, with like the plants pulling up some of those excess nutrients. And it can also help if there's things like certain metals and chemicals that might work as well. But in those cases, you'd have to remove the plants and remove those floating islands at different intervals to kind of get some of those gnarlier things like metals out. Some common plants that people work with when we're looking at the water element is willow, poplar, cottonwood. They all like to have a lot of water. Even some folks, when they're looking at cedar and redwoods, they use that more for kind of like a sewage or gray water idea. And then again, with some of these floating islands, looking at cattails, bulrushes, different types of reeds and sedges, watercress and duckweed are amazing to work with. Ferns, rice is really good at pulling up different heavy metals, especially arsenic. Again, bamboo, if you are in a place where bamboo is local to, but if you are not, which would be pretty much North America, don't use bamboo. There are some places where vetiver is a local regional plant, and it is really good, especially in warmer climates. Vetiver is really good at pulling up different contamination, both in the soil and in the water. So lots of different options there. The key with this, though, is that the actual roots of the plant need to be in the water. I knew a woman who made one of these where she just basically made a raft with regular houseplants and there was no roots in the water. And if the roots are not in the water, they cannot pull things up. They can't do their job. So it definitely needs to be a more of a, aquatic interface. It needs to float. It needs to have an anchor so that if you don't, it doesn't end up somewhere you can't get it, you can't retrieve it. You want plants that are, again, quick growing. And one of the biggest controversies with floating islands is the more corporate versions of these, and some of the ones that were even like more DIY, really relied on plastic. People would make them using plastic kind of bottles as floating devices. And that has become, as we learn more about microplastics and things like that, that has become more of a taboo where people are like, please don't do that. Because, especially if exposed to light, that can really start breaking down and you're adding, different pollutants to the water. So it's about figuring out, like, are there different ways to build these that are a bit more natural, maybe don't have exposed plastic and things like that. And there's been some really creative things. I wanted to highlight this amazing kind of environmental artist, Caitlin Bryson. She did a project which was a really neat mix of both, again, fungi and plants, but she made these living kind of floating island rafts where she used reeds to kind of create the structure. And then she also made these kind of planting cups that were out of oyster mushroom mycelium that she planted her plants into. Like, it's pretty cool in terms of not using plastic. And so that was kind of, she used bamboo, twine, clay, soil, oyster mushrooms, and then again, like cattails and reeds. She was in Nepal. So again, Nepal, bamboo makes more sense there, that we wouldn't use that here. Although if it was dead, maybe, but you could use any kind of structural thing that's not plastic. And then recently there was a workshop, I guess this past year in Washington, where there was this one organization that does really cool work around like beaver restoration and things like that. And I can't remember if they put it on or they just hosted it, but they also were looking at how do you make these floating islands using natural materials. And so they were playing with like gourds and willow and a whole bunch of different things to kind of construct different floating islands. So yeah, I just challenge folks to get creative with that. There are some folks who do like the more large scale floating islands. There's some massive scale ones that are used in places like Asia that do use plastic, but they kind of say that because it's covered and it's not able to act, like kind of have light break it down, it doesn't break down as fast. But this is another option if you want to kind of be creative and not bring microplastics into some of the waters that you love. And again, with water and plants, this is like something we've heard about before. We see rain gardens, we see bioswales in some of our cities. These are all examples of using plants as a bit of a way to deal with stormwater and runoff. And not just plants, also bacteria. And at some point, hopefully also fungi can join this one. So coming to the end, we don't have homework in this course, by the way. There's no homework. But I just wanted to encourage folks that if you were inspired by phytoremediation, and you want to kind of look more into it, maybe consider picking a local plant, especially if you're a group of folks in an area and you're all kind of learning this together. Pick different plants that you're interested in and research them to actually see if they have any phytoremediation potential. Because I've learned a lot by doing that plants I didn't know were actually had anything behind them in terms of research might. And so just if you are interested in kind of looking into that and trying to do some of your own research, you can search online by literally typing the name of the plant plus phytoremediation, or the name of the plant plus hyperaccumulation plus the name of the metal. So you could be like, I don't know, hemp hyperaccumulate lead, and see if any scientific papers come up, and just read the front and the back, results and the synopsis. You can also look at different chemicals and say plant and that chemical and see if you see anything like that. Because again, that can start giving you an idea of what could be promising candidates in your area that you could play with. And yeah, and I highly would just dissuade people from using ChatGPT for this, because I have literally seen people do that where they send me a list of plants where they say, I got this off ChatGPT, and they're wrong. They're not right. And so it's better to kind of try to find some of those original sources and understand what you're reading and what those plants actually do. So that's just my take on it. So that is it for this class. I want to leave time for questions and discussion, especially since it's our first class. So we can do that now. If you have questions, hopefully Charles can help. If any questions popped up in the chat, you can tell me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
There are a number.
Great. And also, if you have a question, you can also put your hand up, like Genesis. Yeah, you want to go Genesis, and then I can start taking other questions from the chat. Go ahead.
Hi, Lila, it's Genesis.
Hi.
My camera isn't working, but I will see your face next week.
Okay.
I had a question about PFAS, dioxins, and furans. I know that you mentioned as far as like heavy metals, like lead, it's not likely to go to the fruiting body. Cadmium, it is. But also, if there's a lot of any kind of heavy metal, it's still likely to get into the fruiting body. How does dioxin and furans, PFAS, PCBs, like how do other contaminants fare as far as getting into the fruiting body in general?
Yeah, so I think and even with the lead, so again, it's like if there is, ideally there's levels of safety, right? Like again, the fruiting body, if you're looking at a tomato plant, for example, there is likely to be tomato versus potato. There's likely to be more lead on the potato than potentially in the tomato if they were grown in the same place. But we see all the time that like they find fruits and vegetables that have lots of lead in it. Like that's not a normal, or like that's something that is pretty common. And that has function to do, if you have soil that people are growing food in that is devoid of microbial life, doesn't have any organic matter, it makes it a lot easier for these metals to move, right? So if people are growing food in very agriculturally degraded places, that might mean that even though it's less likely technically for that metal to get to that fruiting body, it is more likely in that circumstance. If something has happened to that soil that has really kind of swung the pH, let's say to more acidic or whatever, that would also facilitate it going farther into the plant. And also plants that, yeah, those are just a few things. So I was doing work for folks in Gaza and Lebanon, where people were asking that question, like after the wars and after the bombings, what's safe to eat? And it was really hard to say definitively, like, you're safe if you do this and you're not safe if you do that, because it depends on a bunch of things. But you can technically say you are safer eating an apple versus a potato or a lettuce, or especially like cabbage. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just kind of, you have to, and you can always look into it more in terms of like very specifically. Um, but to answer your question, like with dioxins, PFAS, I haven't seen a lot of research yet in terms of like the fate of transport with PFAS. But I
Mm-hmm.
do know, for example, some of the folks, there's folks looking into PFAS and remediation in both Maine and in, I think, Vermont. It's both Maine and Vermont. There's some stuff that's happening up there. And what I thought was really interesting is what some of the folks were looking into was not just how do we pull it up with plants, they were also looking at what plants are not pulling it up. And that's a really
Mm-hmm.
interesting kind of like protective thing. If people are stuck in an environment that's toxic with a contaminant that does not really break down, they were kind of saying, like, what is safe to feed our animals? What is safe to use for crafts and basketry and things like that? Can we find the plants that are just really bad at remediation and really
Mm-hmm.
bad at hyperaccumulation and understand that other side to it? So I don't know with PFAS. I would imagine, again, like a metal, it's like roots and shoots are going to be kind of
Mm-hmm.
where it ends up primarily. But I don't know. With dioxins and PCBs, but especially dioxins, are attracted to kind of lipid and kind of fat part in humans. It's where it accumulates in humans, is in the fat and kind of fatty tissue. Same in animals and same in plants. So, for example, nuts, avocados, um, olives, right? Like this is something like in some of these countries that have been dealing with major war stuff, but love their olives. Like
Mm-hmm.
that is something like the fats could be like where you're finding some of the dioxin potentially, you know?
Okay.
Um, so that's something to consider. Again, with zucchini and pumpkin, there was studies that were done with zucchini and pumpkin and cucumbers and things where they found mostly that the dioxin was ending up in the tendrils and in the shoots and the leaves and not in the fruit.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to grow things like zucchinis and pumpkins, and you were to put things in the soil that would, again, help immobilize, if you were trying not to get it into the plant because you wanted to eat the plant, that would make it less likely for it to end up. Like the last place it's going to end up is the fruit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you want to, if you're trying to eat it, you want to think about ways to interrupt that cycle. But if you're trying to remediate with it, I would take the whole plant. I wouldn't be like, oh, it's only in the roots and shoots. I'm going to leave the fruit unless I could test and know for sure. I hope that
Great. Thank you so
helps. Does
much.
that
Yeah,
help?
super helpful.
Okay.
Um,
It's
any,
complicated.
I know it's super complicated, and there's so many contaminants too, but do you have any thoughts on PCBs also?
PCBs, I think of PCBs kind of like dioxin.
Mm-hmm.
They're like the persistent organic pollutants. They're really hard to break down. They stick around for a while. And the same plants that seem to be good at pulling up dioxins are good at pulling up PCBs. Um,
Okay,
so yeah, I feel like they kind of similar for that.
great. Thank you so much, Lila.
Yeah. I mean, the good thing I'll just quickly say, so it's not all depressing, is that PCBs and dioxins can be broken down, especially with things like microorganisms and fungi. There's been some good research on that. And so it's, at least there's that, whereas PFAS, not so much. So, if you have to pick, you have that versus PFAS, you can breathe a little easier. Any other questions?
There's a number in the chat. Maggie, did you want to just speak yours out? I can read it, but you might just want to say it with a little detail.
I can say it. Yeah, hi, I'm Maggie. We're taking the class as a cohort of some folks in the LA area, and a lot of us have been doing work in Altadena. Sorry, we're next to a gym right now, so I'm sorry if it's noisy. But yeah, a few of us submitted into the chat because we're taking it as a watch party right now.
Love it.
But I'm curious because in Southern California, our plants have a dormancy where a lot of them will dry out or have a really different characteristic of what they're like in the
Mhm,
summer.
mhm.
And we did a project last year where we used bush sunflower, and then it I just hadn't really thought about that part of the life cycle. So I was curious if you could maybe talk about when we're considering that and picking plants, like how that impacts how the contaminants are possibly like reintroduced to the site.
Yeah, it's a really good. I'm from Canada and things just die in the winter, so it's a little different for me. But I would say I would want to get like, you're thinking about things are moving up into the plant as the plant's really healthy, as the plant is growing, and it kind of gets up into it. And then if it kind of goes to sleep or goes dormant, it might bring it back down. And so you would want to remove it before that happens. I would remove the plant. If it's a perennial and if you're doing chemical work, different. I would not. But if you're trying to extract things, I would remove it before that dormancy period, if it was me. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
So also in Southern California, we have the rare case of radioactive
Yeah.
contaminants with
Yeah.
the Rocketdyne situation. What do we do about radioactive contaminants? That's a what I've always had to confront because I live in the like 3 mile radius of the site.
What's the site?
So the Aerojet Rocketdyne site,
Oof,
reactor
okay.
number 2 meltdown, it's the
Mm,
one of the worst nuclear disasters in the US, besides of course, the New Mexico uranium mining ones.
right, right, right.
But
Yeah.
I don't know what to really do about that because I've grown up seeing like fruit growing in the area and wanted to know what the thoughts were on that.
Mm. So I mean, it's radioactive metals, right? Like it's like plutonium, uranium, cesium, things like that, strontium, like some of those things, radioactive iodine or whatever, right? Um, those are it's like metals suck, and those suck so much worse. Because there are plants that can pull up that. I actually have a whole slide on some of those, and so I can share that. I'll post that so you have it. But like things like sunflower and I think it's like the tulip maple. There's a bunch of different plants that they've tested to be like these can uptake it. But then again, they uptake it, and then where do you send it? You literally have to send it to someplace for radioactive waste, which I don't think people have figured out really well in North America or anywhere. So, and again, there is some folks who've looked at like there's fungi that have been, useful in breaking some of that stuff down or like, kind of dealing with it. But it's like radiation's really hard. It's really hard. It tends to, again, hyperaccumulate. So I wouldn't eat like things like mushrooms from a place like that. I wouldn't eat seaweed from a place like that. If I don't know if it's coastal or not. Uh, and again, with things like the fruiting of anything, I would also be trying to work with anything that can immobilize. I haven't looked into like biochar and radiation, but this is a radioactive metal. So it's like if you can't get it out, you don't want it to go up into. That's kind of, but what we know from things like Chernobyl is that, it just becomes like the trees and all these different things absorb it, right? And I know that one of the things they're looking at with Chernobyl is that they have this whole forest that has taken up the radiation, which in some ways has made it less bioavailable. But if there's ever a forest fire, it's like that is all going to be released, right? I mean, ideally, if I was you, I wouldn't eat the stuff from it if you could avoid it. But yeah, I'm sorry. That's not an easy one to deal with.
No worries. I was just curious because
Yeah.
it's something I grew up with and it kind of just was normal here. So
Yeah.
I was like, I've never heard anyone talk about radioactivity and bioremediation in
Yeah, yeah,
tandem.
yeah. People have definitely looked into it. Like people have looked into it for Ukraine, for Japan. I'll look up some stuff and I'll share them. I haven't, it's been a minute since I've done it, but like, yeah. What's your name?
My name is Neve.
Neve? Okay, yeah. If I find anything, I'll send it. I'll post it for everybody, but like for you especially.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
no
you.
problem. Okay. What else we got? Yeah,
Leah,
Lee said the melanistic fungi in terms of breaking down uh radiation, and that is absolutely true. Yeah. It's just figuring out like how do you actually apply that at a large scale? But that's something that they have absolutely found.
Leah had a question. Do you want to speak it out or should I read it? Leah Adams.
Yes, I wanted to
Hi.
know if you wanted to share about zeolites.
Zeolites. That is something I do not have as much experience in, although I know some people who are doing incredible work with that. And that would be more of an immobilization and kind of like a absorption, right? Do you have
Yeah.
information on that?
Yes, we're using that at Metabolic Studio,
Okay.
working with Maru Garcia,
Yeah.
who has a project Prospering Backyards and has had some really good data on that and very good results. And I was
Okay.
recently surprised to see it is now sold in 50-gallon buckets at Home Depot.
Yeah. Yeah. I know people who are doing like, I've seen a lot of people who are more in the big corporate remediation world looking at zeolites
Okay.
and stuff like that. But if you have any information that you can share with the group on that, I'd be really interested to see that project in
I think
particular.
we can do that for sure.
Awesome. That's super cool. And there's also, I mean, I know folks who are looking at things like different, but clay and how clay is really good at, immobilizing in certain ways and stuff. So yeah, we can get really creative with this for sure. So I like your background. You look very astral. Looks good.
Thank you.
My hair's too big, so I can't do the backgrounds because it just does
Yeah.
weird things. But yeah. I see a question from Elijah. Elijah, do you want to read it or do you want me to read it?
Sure, I can read it.
Go
Can
for
you
it.
hear me? Okay, cool.
Yes. Hi.
Yeah, I was just asking to see if there's any, there seems to be a lot of information, right, about or research papers about, the remediation of the different items. So I was wondering,
Mhm.
is there some kind of wiki or database that's publicly available for us to, look through to see all this research and, refer back
That
to?
would, yeah, no, that would be great. There is so not there needs to be a better, bigger one. I think University of Kansas has a phytoremediation database. And I think I have it on the Mighty Network. When I open up the phytoremediation section, you'll see it. It's one of the links, but it's hard to access. You have to have like your system needs to sync up with their system. So they have it, but it's also with phytoremediation. It's like people are constantly testing new things. And so I haven't seen something that's like constantly updating. And so it would be great if there was people who did do that outside of kind of, again, like I don't know how limited the University of Kansas one is, but that's the only one I've seen. And then I've seen certain places where regionally some people will make their own kind of bioregional plant lists. But I think it's one of those like to do things that we need to see in kind of grassroots remediation where people start sharing that knowledge and coming up with something like that.
Gotcha. Okay. Good to know. Good to know.
Yeah. And you also had a question, how does plant testing work?
Yes, yes, I did
Yes.
want to know that.
Yeah. So plant testing, this is where, and we're going to talk about soil testing in one of the later classes, but when we're doing phytoremediation and when we're doing any remediation, but specifically if we're looking at plants, it's like when you're going to test your soil before you plant everything to be like, this is what I got, this is how much of this, and then you're going to plant your plants, grow your plants, and then when it comes time to kind of, harvest the plant, remove the plant, if you're doing something like a hyperaccumulator, then you're going to test the soil at that point to kind of see, is there a difference? Like has it actually decreased or not? If it hasn't decreased at all, you don't need to test the plant. If you had I don't know, 500 something of lead to begin with, and at the end you still got 500, don't even waste your money on testing the plant. But if there's like, oh, where did it go? That could be a thing where, you want to test the plant because you want to know, like, did it go into the plant or is it somehow bound in like, organic matter and other things in the soil? But how you basically test plants is like you would send it to a university or send it to a lab and they would test the tissue of the plant. I've only ever just sent it. I've never actually done it. There are some like DIY or more like infield ways to test soil, but there isn't that for testing plants. That's kind of more of the lab, the kind of more techie lab side of things.
Gotcha.
But
Okay.
we will cover, when we talk about soil testing, we're going to talk about some things where you can actually do the soil testing in the field and a few different, not cheap, but not crazy expensive ways to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. What else? I'm just going to go through things
Yeah,
and yeah, tell me if I miss anything.
some of this has been covered.
Okay. Yeah, because you guys don't know I'm going to say it and then I say it. So Ryan, hi Ryan. Your question was, is there a good list of places to get soil, water, food, and seed testing that folks use? I found lists that are very specific to like in the United States, for example, it'll be very specific to different states. Like sometimes you can find like New York will have a list of like you could go to these places or like it seems to be quite localized. And it really depends on, where you live. There are different programs depending on where you live. There are some places that offer like, certain levels of like free heavy metals testing. It's almost impossible to get free chemical testing. Chemical testing is way more expensive than heavy metals testing. And that is usually something that you got to find funding for, or you got to befriend a university, get them excited about your project and get them to give it to you for free or discounted. I know of one remediator who actually built a relationship with a private lab over the years, and then they gave her a bunch of free testing. And I was working on a project in kind of northern British Columbia where we got 50% off our testing for creosote. Because somebody on the lab team was really excited about mushrooms and we were doing a microremediation project. So it's always worth asking, but I have not seen like one list for everywhere. It just
Awesome.
really depends on where you are. Where are you located?
I'm actually in northern New Mexico, Espanola area. So we also just
Oh,
had actually
yeah.
worked with Caitlin Bryson.
Hey,
Yeah,
cool.
so we
Yeah.
have a place called the Espanola Healing Foods Oasis that I work with. And we do a whole bunch of different stuff, but I'm in charge of kind of food and seed sovereignty, also water testing and
Okay.
some other bits and pieces. And we're just trying to put together some things to bring out into the community to support some things, especially since we just had the tritium release here in
Oh no. And tritium's
so
heavy. It's that radioactive water.
yeah, so we're
Yeah.
concerned about some of those things, and we're trying to track
Okay.
down some places to get the tritium or some of the samples we've gathered tested for tritium and some other things, but really just trying to make the process for because a lot of the areas here are like local farmers and other stuff, and they
Mm,
still use areas for direct food consumption. And so we just want to make that process as clean cut for them as possible and trying to put
mm.
that into things that we can share out. So it's an adventure.
Yeah, it is. And again, it's an adventure. Like if you have a local kind of university, regional university that has soil testing and they're willing to work with you, that can make it really easy. But if they're not, then it's more about like having to go the private way, and that becomes, I think, more difficult and expensive.
That's been actually, can I add a little
Yeah,
question onto
please.
it? So because of the history of kind of the Los Alamos National Laboratory
Hmm.
and the fact that there's a lot of indigenous people here who don't trust things like sources coming from particular like sites or where we do have the option, because I have located some free testing for food and free testing for other things, but they're often connected to the laboratory,
Mm,
Department of Energy, through the Department of other things. And so we're trying to figure out sources to find, and we might end up going private if we can.
hmm.
But have you ever encountered anything so far where, uh, like, getting data back that's actually or withheld because of what's actually found in locations and having that impact or possibly impact like lawsuits and things of that nature?
Yeah. I personally haven't, I'm trying to think. I haven't personally had that happen with remediation. I've had that happen in other environmental justice work that I've done. But I used to live in Louisiana, and there was definitely like some universities who were taking like big money
Mhm.
from BP.
Yep.
And the results that were coming out of all their studies about how bad BP had messed up the Gulf were always quite positive as a
Right.
result of where they were getting their money from. And so it was like really understood you couldn't trust that. Right. So I totally understand that. And even with some private labs, like again, a lot of those private labs, their bread and butter is actually like industry. Industry's paying their bills, right?
Yep.
So I would wonder in a situation like yours, if actually going outside of state to another university that doesn't
That's
have connections to kind of like the nuclear industry, if that's something you could maybe get, you know?
that's kind of what we're looking into
Yeah.
now. So
Okay.
thank you
If
so
I
much.
think of anybody, I'm gonna send them your way, because now you got me thinking of like who are some cool soil science people who'd be willing to be like, let me test for free and
Nice.
come out there, you know?
We'll take any support we can get. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
No problem. And that's so cool. I feel like, did you work with Caitlin on the kind of those mushroom pillows?
So
Those-
I came in a little bit later,
Okay.
but Caitlin's now doing some other stuff with one of the universities as well.
Okay.
And so we're working on a new project directly with her. But yeah, I managed the garden where they put in some of those pillows. She's
Yeah.
also done some different sites as well, which I have not been to yet. But one of the sites directly, which is the Espanola Healing Foods Oasis,
Yeah.
did some of that work. I definitely am there pretty much every single day. So it's fun to be connected to that stuff.
That is so cool. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna definitely think of places that can test soil for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. What else?
And you somewhat answered this one, but maybe they are looking for more information.
Mhm.
If you test plant tissues from metals, how do we know it's accurate? It accumulated from the soil. Is there a ratio we should expect based on what's in the soil? And this one's from Lynn.
That's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure, Lynn, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. What are you thinking with that? Do you mind like just giving a bit more context?
Oh, I was just curious, like,
Yeah.
if the soil is like 100 parts per million lead and we grow like a corn or sunflower or something, we test the tissue, like, I don't know, should it be, is it, I don't know, we expect like 2, 10, like
Mm,
20, yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think that's tough because and I have it like with plant testing, like I would imagine, like how much of it do you have to test to get a good idea? Because it's like not one plant took up all of that, right? So you're not going to see like you did a certain amount of like, samples, and then you're going to see kind of it's not going to be represented in one plant. But I think the testing of the
Right.
plant, what you are looking for. So here's maybe the better thing is if it's not in the soil, that's the first win. And then you want to know where it is. And then in that situation, people are testing the plant more because they want to know how to dispose of the plant. And so if the plant has really, somehow it has low levels, even though there's not any it's really gone down in the soil, but the plant doesn't have a lot, that could be because of other like microbial fungal things that have happened in the soil, right? Or it might be because it's in the roots. So in a situation like that, if you actually kind of, you might be able to dispose of the plant just like regular garbage. And I think that's kind of more where they're going with it, where it's like, or you could even, if the plant has like almost nothing in it, you maybe could compost it. But more likely, you want to know, like, is there actual stuff in the plant? How do you have to treat it in terms of disposing of it safely? And some people, again, paying for the plant tissue sampling is really expensive. So unless you have a university that's like, I'm your best friend and I want to know this, then which is rare, if you have that, then do it. Otherwise, you would just be like, if it's not in the soil, I'm just going to assume it's in the plants and I'm going to handle them appropriately, right? And just kind of make the safe guess with that. I think people
Cool.
seem to, what I've noticed is if it's radiation or if it's PFAS, you have universities being like, I want to know where it goes. But if it's
Yeah.
anything else, they kind of are like, they don't really care as much. So,
Yeah, I was curious too, was that study on PFAS, like they tested the plant tissue also?
Yeah.
Like,
They were testing the plant tissue, and I think what they found, because what they wanted to see was where was it ending up in the plant, because they were like, because there's some parts of the hemp that we can use, and I think they kind of were like, it's all up in there, and so they didn't have that thing again where it's like this is safe and this is not when it came to the hemp, but there is again. There was funding they got, and it wasn't just that group I talked about. It was other folks also got funding. Other researchers got funding to look at the opposite side to be like, what are the safe plants? And they were also testing to be like, are they picking up PFAS at all? And I would think in a situation like that, they're probably taking a lot of biomass and concentrating it and then testing it to kind of see like when it's kind of shrunk down, how much you have in there, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And that probably is only done by like a university, right? Like, I don't think a commercial lab does that.
Maybe, I mean, there are commercial labs that have to do food safety testing, right? With
Okay.
agriculture, you know? So I think maybe, but I don't know them as well and which ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Rachel Morgaine had a question
Yeah.
about disposal, and I was curious, Rachel, if you wanted to speak to that, in particular, what you were asking.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry I did miss the beginning of the talk, so if I missed this
Oh, I
really
completely
obvious
explained
part.
it. No, I didn't. You're safe.
No,
Yeah.
but you know, this question of disposal, particularly for these long-lived things, I mean, is it just a matter of concentrating it all in one place and choosing a site that is not going to do anything else other than be your waste site, whether that's on site or, you know, off site? Or, you know, has there been any other thinking as to how to do that removal, any coordination, you know, about kind of collectively deciding this is going to be. I work with an Indigenous community that has a lot of PFAS because they're next to a base here in Australia,
Okay.
um, and so there's a national park because of the way Australia works. It's a national park and a military base,
Okay.
and it's a site where a jointly managed national park with the traditional custodians. And so there's not a lot of land to play with where you would want to just like dump your waste.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what is the thinking around that?
So, yeah, I mean, again, it depends. So you're looking at PFAS, right?
In this case, yeah, PFAS, but I'm sort of also generally interested in other things that are not breaking down, that are just accumulating in the
Like heavy
biomass, and
metals.
then yeah.
Yeah. So I think again, it's one of those things where I know with PFAS, like that project in Maine, it was funny. The government didn't care that people got the land all contaminated with PFAS, and then the moment they started trying to remediate it, everybody was on them to be like, "Don't put it there! Don't put it there! Don't you dare put it there!" Like they were really like freaking out about it, which is funny because it's like, well, you didn't care when it was just literally contaminating people. But I think they had to take it to toxic waste. They had to actually dispose of it as toxic waste, which again is funny because PFAS is not everywhere. But when you
Yeah.
start, if
Yeah,
you start
yeah.
handling it, if you start removing it, it's like that.
Yeah.
I think with heavy metals, again, the most common thing that people do, and I would say this in North America, it's not the most common thing everywhere. There's places where the landfill isn't far away. So like I've been working in places like Lebanon and Palestine where they're like, the landfill is just going to be like a pit over there by so-and-so's house. And so it doesn't feel good to just put something there. So they're trying to think through like, what's the other option? But a lot of projects here will kind of like bag up the waste and send it to a landfill or send it to toxic disposal site. The thing you mentioned is this idea of, again, instead of exporting the problem to some other community or some other situation, again, taking responsibility and saying this is a shit deal. But again, we have a site that we cleaned up 90% of it, and there's going to be this 10% that we are going to manage as the sacrifice zone. And we're going to steward it and manage it as such. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to do that, where the objective is to minimize and reduce volume of this waste, but then to try to lock it down, you know? And again, locking it down can be, you know, using things like biochar, or like, again, feeding it to trees that are like long lived, and you're not doing edible things with it or making baby furniture out of it or something like, you know, things like that. It can be taking that little bit left to incineration or to a landfill, but it's a lot less and it's more immobilized. So even if it goes to those places, it's less likely to kind of cause problems. You know, there was one group I was talking to who had this idea of like using worms to kind of because they'll eat through it and they'll hyperaccumulate it in their bodies. They kind of suck it in, and then they were going to burn the worms, which was kind of heartless. I love worms, so I couldn't do that. But people get real creative and real dire with this, you know? So I think, and again, I think there's a future where we can actually, with the metals, nobody wants the PFAS, but like with the metals, we can start capturing that, you know, and reusing it or something. But that's just not what's available to people right now. So it's kind of, it really depends on the situation, and whether, if you know, if it's a sacrifice zone that people want to take responsibility for, really also thinking through like, what are the chances that there's runoff, or this could flood out and get to a river, like really thinking through some of those pieces. There's also folks, I was working with people in Holland who we're trying to kind of like encapsulate it in pottery and make art out of it, or glass, or there's actually a conventional remediation, big corporate conventional remediation is this thing called vitrification, where they basically superheat something and turn it into volcanic glass. Very expensive and not something we can do. But like, there's people choices, I don't know. There's no good answer for it, which is why, again, it's actually why some people choose to not extract it. It's why people sometimes say phytoremediation is sexy and great for certain things, but maybe I want to try to find a way to immobilize it and lock it down instead. Kind of like the earth has a way of burying things that it doesn't, sometimes that's another option, because if you didn't, you'd have to find all these different things to manage.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. If you come up with something, I want to know. I'd be interested. Francis?
Hey, well, thanks. I just had an idea because when somebody mentioned pottery, and then I always wanted a perspective from somebody who's more closer to the non-industry incentive side of this, because I heard this perspective all being maybe the PFAS, maybe the most extreme example, but plastic as a very stable long-term carbon sink because it doesn't deteriorate for hundreds of years. So then it becomes like when you talk about these very hyperstable compounds that are very long lasting, I think it's more, even there could be arguments around it's more about where it's concentrated. So somebody talk pottery and art, but maybe like, insulation, longer term functional things to aggregate them. Like I don't want to hear like what's your thoughts on that, because if we did bioremediation with stuff that's not suitable for food use. And then we, for example, made like you heard like in Japan, places where have more access, they can extract the metals, and maybe we make bioplastic out of the biomass, and then they are used in construction. I mean, they'll eventually go back to soil, but it's a cycle. But it's a slower sink. I mean, I do some work in wildfire management just on the side, and then kind of it feels the same unless the carbon's below ground. A forest fire just resets it anyways. So might as well just find longer term storage for it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think when we're dealing with certain contaminants, there is this thing where people want the perfect solution, the one that's like the magic wand. And I think there's some contaminants where we don't have that. And then we have to get really strategic and think through a lot of different options. And I mean, there's people who look at, can we put this into building construction materials, like you were saying, like what does some of that look like? And I would say, I think it depends on the stability and what it's being used for, because I think there is a thing. There was a project or something where they were dealing with this. It was in the Caribbean, and they were getting all this really contaminated seaweed, because seaweed's a hyperaccumulator. They were getting these huge kind of wash-ups of contaminated seaweed, and people were making bricks out of it, or doing this thing where they were like, we're going to make bricks out of it in construction. But something like that, high in heavy metals, it's like the dust over time. Like it's like if we're going to make construction stuff out of this, it has to be incredibly stabilized in a way that it's not easily coming back into people's lives and into kind of easily accessible contamination. And then we have to think about what happens when a fire rolls through, what happens when we demolish that building, or what happens when, because that is these moments where it releases it again. But if we have certain contaminants where it's like, we are dealing with compromised choices. So I think it's just, if that's a line, it's a line to look at for sure. But I think the question always is what is the structure it's going to be in, and how stable is that, and how delayed the release will be. And not getting, because again, some of these brick things where you're like that, or some of the hemp stuff where you're like, that's not tight enough. Like I can see that being a problem in 10 years, 5 years, or if there's like the wrong kind of impact on that structure. And so I think we just really need to, if we're going to do that, we got to do it really well. But yeah, I haven't seen too much. Have you seen research on that? Like, have you seen people trying?
Well, I mean, I do a lot of randoms, like I work in entrepreneurship, so there's a
Yeah.
lot of cross streams. I mean, and you mentioned this is like there's a lot of people doing hempcrete. I was thinking, you say hemp is
Yeah.
an accumulator,
Mhm.
but then we would, so it's like I work on the economic side of this, right? So I can
Mhm.
see an industry spawning out of buying contaminated lands for negative money, like paying pay to buy it, growing hemp out of it,
Mhm.
packing this like like now contaminated hemp using hempcrete, and they sell a really good greenwash story, being like, "Oh my God, funding everywhere." And
Yes.
now that
Yes.
contamination is in everybody's house. I can see that happening. I can even see
Problem.
myself making money out of that. But then I have a student who did coastal carbon in Canada. They're out of
Yeah.
Waterloo, which is my alma mater. And then they did the thing where they use sensors that are dipping into the coastal ocean because the farmers that farm kelp, you talk about seaweed as a carbon accumulator. And all they did was to have a sensor that measured the density of seaweed and say like, oh, these farmers have been growing this much seaweed, they sequester this much carbon, and they made $2 million per client per year. And then they're like, I think she's in like Forbes on 30 on the 30. It's quite a big story out of that. But if you hear, but it's the same thing here, right? It's the same thing being like we sell a really good story about we capture carbon, we capture all these contaminants, we're going to use material, upcycle them, people get carbon credits, and now we're going to move that contaminant somewhere else and put it in people's houses.
Yeah.
And then, and it's scary because I can personally sell all these stories and get funding.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
so it's,
Yeah, because
it's
people
not, is
want
it the
that.
right
They
thing to
want that.
do, right? Kind of
Yeah.
question
Yeah.
that I want to ask.
But you get it. Like it's like people want that solution, but it's
Yeah.
not always safe. And if we can figure out a way to make it safer, okay, but we got to be careful with that. Because I was talking to somebody who wants to use like kind of extract PFAS and make space. Like, people will go anywhere with this. And I think again, we do have to consider that some of these places, like if we can't extract it and we can't safely dispose of it, how do we immobilize it? But if you're immobilizing something, you got to immobilize it and you got to keep your eyes on it. You can't just kind of do it and walk away.
That's actually
Right?
great because then like, maybe let me give the comment, Lisa. Maybe I can want to probe your brain on this because I have this one of my doctoral thesis project is to kind of work has to build a framework of assessing societal resilience.
Mhm.
And I kind of had to map out the parameters about it. And I kind of want to probe your brain on what you just talked about, being like all these regenerative innovations that are happening. Because I wanted to evaluate the framework for if a sustainable, if like a innovation project is actually used to increase societal resilience, like increasing society adaptive capacity. So and then they interview experts around like what are these kind of pitfalls to look for? Because I don't know them. So
Mhm.
maybe it's great if I can
Yeah.
connect on LinkedIn or something afterwards.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Yeah, let's keep chatting about that. I want to hit a few more questions because we're almost at time, but it's like you got my brain buzzing. Um, Emma, if there's anybody who had a burning question that we didn't hit in the chat and you want to hear it before the end, put your hand up. I'm just going to hit Emma's question in the meantime, which asks, how do we know we have successfully mobilized a contaminant? Because a soil test will still show it's present. You can test, there's certain things where you can test for availability in a soil test. So I think that's one of the things that you would look for. And that would be actually one of those things where you would also test maybe some of the plants and things around it. But there are folks who work with things like biochar, for example, where they can actually see kind of, what has happened in terms of the different contaminants like sorbing to the char and becoming less available. So there are ways to know that. But it is a bit complex. So that is a good question. I'm going to take Yima because we haven't heard from Yima yet.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. I was wondering about maybe I guess you mentioned earlier that about Chernobyl and like how it took up all that radiation and like the one thing people are worried about is that big wildfire. I just finished my like I guess firelighter training with Terra, which is a intertribal group up north, and they've been teaching a lot of people about good fire and why we need like smaller, like good fire, and how we're in a deficit. And I feel like this might be a good way of like fielding for, I would say like against like these big wildfires that we're seeing that are bringing out these bad contaminants. So I'm wondering if you have anything on good fire or like smaller fires like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think thank you for sharing that and also for bringing up this interesting point of there are situations where our best option is to prevention. Like we do not want some of these bigger impacts like a major catastrophic wildfire that impacts a community or infrastructure, that is what causes so much toxicity and damage. And if we're doing things like cultural burning, prescribed fire, things that actually reduce the risk of that and create kind of more resilient forests, we are less likely to see those catastrophic wildfires that cause that level of toxicity and these kind of major releases. So I mean, I'm a big fan. I'm like, we need to see a lot more of that good fire and that cultural burning, and Indigenous people need to be leading that and being given the space to do that and have some of that red tape cleared away. Because I know in the North, there's so much red tape to get some of that and to get that space to do it. It's actually interesting is one of the organizations I work for, we were just having a conversation about a cultural burn that had happened. And folks were also looking at ways to do kind of, you know, micro restoration, remediation, not because there was toxicity, but just being like, how do we help the land heal? Because it was a bit a higher intensity burn than they wanted to do because it was more of a logging area that they were trying to kind of help heal or address. But there was just, yeah, it was a really neat conversation that Maya was a part of, Maya Elson. But yeah, no, I think that's a great way to think about things. And again, we want more of those to happen so that we don't see these mega fires and these fires that are causing so much damage. Because fire used to be a beautiful thing that was important and necessary for the ecosystem, for traditional food, for all these different things. And because of what we haven't allowed to happen because of colonization and things like that, plus climate change and everything, it's created a situation where fire is becoming a bit of a destructive force when it was never supposed to be that way. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I hope does that answer your question?
I think there was like a part that I was like not
Yeah.
sure if I asked.
Okay, ask it. Yeah, because I'm like, I don't know.
I think it was like, I mean, if we're creating like these mosaics rather than these large like fires,
Okay.
would they in retrospect be beneficial? Like because although like let's say this field has done its vital remediation, taken up all these things, and we're worried about that releasing in a large way. And so we like burn bits, you know, bit by bit, over a course of certain years, and seeing how I guess that would work. I guess my current guess is like it brings back like healthier plants too, so it can continue doing the take up. But yeah, I don't know, maybe just like
Okay, so are you asking like if someone were to do like phytoremediation and then you were to do a cultural burn?
yes, yeah.
Yeah, what the effect of that would be. If they were doing phytoremediation and it was something like they were dealing with chemicals and the plants that were kind of, doing that, I don't know. I mean, I think ideally what you would want to do in a situation like that, or okay, if you have metals or chemicals, you would want a site that like you did phytoremediation on for a few years and you got those levels down as much as possible. Then you want to remove some of those plants that are holding it. You want to remove them. If they're holding on, if they are kind of hyper accumulators, you don't want to burn those. So if you could try to find a way to remove those and kind of pull them out, especially if they're annuals, and then do a burn, because otherwise you would just re-release that in and kind of disperse it, right? Which is not ideal. But the cultural burn would help with all this other kind of revitalization and restoration in a different way. But if you were dealing with plants that had already accumulated certain things because that had already happened, I would try to find a way to get those out of there if possible. Does that help?
Yes, yes.
You're making my mind
Awesome.
bend. I'm like, I've never
Oh
thought of
my
the two
God,
together.
yes.
I love it. I love it. It's
I'm
great.
jazzed right now.
Yeah, no, that's super awesome. Super awesome. Also, I'm seeing so many great comments in the chat. I saw one person, I think it was Julia. Is it Julia was asking about pollinators and wildlife and phyto. And maybe we don't have enough time to talk about it today, but there's some really interesting stuff I'll share in terms of honey and pollen and nectar and all this stuff and how that actually can accumulate different things, but how bees have this really interesting way of filtering that out. But also this idea of with some of our phytoplants, we want to actually like cut down certain parts of them because we are worried. We are worried about animals eating that or dealing with that. Even when I was talking about cover crops, like things like alfalfa and clover that are good at chemicals, but they also hyperaccumulate things, we wouldn't feed that to livestock because of that, right? And same thing if we had sunflowers or certain plants that, you had cadmium and things in the soil, you would cut the head down so you don't have things like that are trying to like get nectar and pollen and all that stuff from that and it potentially impacting them. But I think there's ways around it. So we can talk a bit more about that in a future class. It's a really good thing to think about because the bees, man, we love the bees. Okay, final two questions. Maggie and Genesis.
Hi, Layla. I'm Nina. Thank you so
Hi.
much for this great class.
Hi, Nina.
I had like a two-parter, and I know we're short on time, so feel free to only answer what we have time for. But
Yeah.
knowing that contaminants usually only make their way into roots and leaves and sometimes stems,
They
is
make their
there
way
any
first. I wouldn't say they
first?
only do. That's where they kind
Yeah.
of like, someone comes into your house and they go to your couch before they go to your bedroom. They
Right.
go there first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is there ever a safe way to use like flowers or like some plant parts as mulch, or is it usually best practice to kind of remove the whole plant, properly dispose of it? No
Yeah,
matter.
I
Okay.
think it's best practice to remove it
Yeah.
unless if you were using a plant for hyperaccumulation of
Sure.
metals, it's best practice
Sure.
just because unless you can test it. And again, it's hard to test it, but if you can test it, then you could maybe find out that no, we're fine. You know what I mean? And again, I would say
Yeah.
something like if you had sunflowers and your lead levels were moderate, they weren't super high, right?
Mhm.
They were like low to moderate. I would be, and lead was your only contender, I would feel okay with the sunflower tops,
Interesting.
right?
Okay.
Because
Cool.
lead is a clunk, and if you had lead and the soil was a bit neutral alkaline, I'd be like, don't worry about your tops. That's why the pH thing, it gets a bit complicated, but it's groovy. You can get into it. You just got to kind of hit your stride. But that's why it's important because but it depends. Like if cadmium was in the mix, you'd be like, I got to cut that down. Right. So
Yeah.
it depends on
Totally.
what metals you have present
Yeah.
and the what the soil's doing. So you could even have a situation where you're trying to get lead out of the soil and there's cadmium and you get a lot of it out and then there's some left and then you try to immobilize what's left. And then your
Mhm.
flowers and stuff for the bees and the pollinators are going to be okay at that point because it'll be harder for those things to get up. And we're going to talk about this in the microbial class, but simple things like compost and organic matter can do a lot when it comes to some of that immobilization, or adding even things like phosphorus when it comes to lead can do a lot, right? So there are tools if you're really worried about the little ones, but it's also about kind of the stages and the phases. So maybe you have a bunch of sunflower times where you cut the heads off and it's real sad for everyone, but then like a few seasons, you just let it all go, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And then
Yeah.
for like long-lived plants like trees,
Yeah.
would you say it's like safer since if you're like not actively digging in that soil,
Mhm.
like would there be any need to like remove those trees or long-lived plants?
What people will do is people will sometimes remove the leaves. Like if
Oh,
you live in a place where, well, if you live in a place where the leaves fall, I don't know if
right.
LA, that probably doesn't happen. Y'all just stay green all the
It does
time.
for a lot of our species like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that could be a way to get things out. Do you know what I mean? Right? Because if you're
Yeah.
like, if there's some amount of it, but in some of these situations, again, it's like, where is it ending up in the tree? And I haven't looked
Yeah.
into this as much, but that could be something like you could easily kind of Google that and find out like that fate of transport, like where is some of these metals ending up in a willow or in a poplar? And if the bulk of them are ending up in the kind of the woody material and the branches, but not
Mhm.
necessarily making it up to the leaves, you don't have to worry about that. And if you do
Okay.
have a place where, again, you're trying to remove something out of a place, you might at some point want to cut and take it away. But
Got you.
if you are kind of okay with it being immobilized, that, that can happen. People would do stuff without coppice too. Like there's ways where they kind of
Yeah.
are trying to
That's what
move
people
things
do,
out.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You can get creative. And willow's pretty easy to work with in that way because it's really quick, right? But there are
Yeah.
some longer lived trees that you wouldn't cut necessarily, right?
Right.
You would kind of work with it where it is.
Yeah, I imagine there's a lot of native plants too that can be coppiced or taken down. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. It can get so complex, and I'm just doing teasers with all these different kind of topics. But yeah, Fido is awesome. There's so much there. Okay, final question. Genesis?
Yes, it is me.
Yes.
So I have two questions. Feel free to play the Oscar music if it's too much.
Well, I'll stay. Anyone else can leave, although I'm sure they're going to be good questions. And if anybody has a question that I didn't answer and you want me to answer it, I'll stay later. So
Oh
or
my
just,
gosh, that's a dangerous offering. I'm
yeah,
just
don't
letting you
not too
know
much
now.
later, but like,
Yes. Okay.
yeah.
All right. So first question is, I kind of had a unique situation with a community member who
Mhm.
came to me with around 30 parts per million of lead. They
Ooh.
had phytoremediated with sunflowers in their front yard. And after they did retesting, they actually got higher levels that were like upward of like 100 parts per million. And so we were really confused
Mm.
by the results. And so I didn't do the soil sampling or testing for this community member. So it's
Uh-huh.
kind of hard to know how they took the samples and whatnot. And so, and this was also to kind of give some added context. This was also after we had had like a couple of days of rain as
Uh-huh.
well. So I was wondering, like, is it possible that the sunflowers might have, uptaken like lead that had already percolated down further and then brought it back up to the kind of like, more top layers. And then maybe they didn't do a really good job of getting rid of the roots. I'm just trying to think of ideas of like why it would
Yeah.
increase so much.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few things like again, Francis, lead rain. Oof. Yeah. Like acid rain. Um, Which is interesting. I didn't even think about acid rain as being a thing where it's like lead is more mobile when things are acidic, but it wasn't that much rain that could have done that.
Mhm.
I think there's a few pieces here. It's kind of like a who done it because you weren't there when the person did their sampling. You don't know how they sampled and you don't know from where they sampled. So if what they're saying is like they sampled the same spot at the same depth, you know what I mean? And they got two
Mhm.
different readings like a few weeks apart. Well, that is really interesting. But if they did something like a composite sample, which we'll talk about in a few classes, where they took, samples from all different parts of the site and then mixed them, and then they did that again in a few weeks, but maybe they were from slightly different parts of the site, or maybe there'd been runoff from another site onto their site. Because that's the other thing with rain. Like, was there any way that things had run onto their site from another site? Like,
So from
I
what
don't
I
know.
remember, yeah, like topography wise, it didn't
Hmm.
seem like they're not on a hill or anything
Hmm.
like that.
Hmm.
They seem pretty even in terms
Hmm.
of where they're situated. But it's definitely possible. I'd love to check in with them to see if they'd be
Yeah.
willing to do any other tests.
Yeah. Because
Because I think
there's
it's
too many like unknowns of like how does and like where did they sample and could it be even like another part of this site where the rain kind of ran off from but that was a bit more high lead or not, right? The idea
Mhm,
you had though with the sunflower is like, again, it takes a plant time to pull things up and to move it up into the plant. And
mhm,
lead is kind of like real slow and chill in a certain way as a metal, whereas think
mm,
of cadmium as like really high strung and intense. And so like lead moves slow. And so it'll get into the roots and then it'll be like, maybe I want to go a bit higher. And it kind of moves slowly. So there is a chance that it kind of got up, but didn't quite get all the way up, you know?
mhm.
But it's like it could also be runoff. It could also be how they tested. It could be a lot of different things.
I know that you mentioned too earlier in the presentation that you want to wait for all the heavy metals to accumulate to the roots and or not to the roots, but you want it to get out of the roots so it can get to the shoots and the stems. How can you really know when the optimal time is for that? Like besides like the plant just
Mm.
reaches maturity or it starts to go to seed.
Yeah, I would say it's like think about like the upward motion of the plant when that's kind of at its peak. And again, when we get into that time of like autumn or winter where things start to kind of draw back down, that is, you want to hit it before then, right? You
Okay.
want to hit it like when things are really like growing and there's a lot of upward movement with the plant. And if you wait till things start to kind of start drying out and start dying back, it literally could mean that like some of that stuff could start returning to the soil.
Okay.
It
Okay.
depends on the plant, depends on a bunch of different things, but just if you're going as a general way, that's kind of the smarter kind of way to hit it.
Okay. So when it's
Yeah,
at its peak upward motion. Um,
ideally, yeah. Or even, I
ideally.
mean, some people do it just like the longer you leave a plant, the more it accumulates. But again, it's like you want
Mhm.
to leave it long, but you don't want to wait till it starts to again go to sleep or start to die.
Mhm.
So kind of hit it at its prime, you know?
Okay,
Mhm.
good to know. And the last thing that I was going to mention is that this is an idea that I've been tinkering with. I wonder if you've ever met anyone with a similar idea, or bear with me on the ethics of it, because I've not tried it, but I was thinking about having like, goats graze through phytoremediation plants and then testing, their poop and like how it sequesters in their manure, and
Mm.
then also considering, having them eat, a healthy diet along with the phytoremediation plants as well to see that if it could like possibly um mitigate the amount of metals that accumulates like in the actual poop, so that we could like actually spread it in places and so it's not all accumulated in a concentrated way. I've also thought about the fact that certain heavy metals too, like lead for example, would hyperaccumulate like in the bones of the goat eventually after eating like a lot of this contaminated plants. And you would let the goat essentially live its the entirety of its life, and then we would likely just, give it a burial, and then over its burial, we would grow a tree over the goat, and then, it would
Uh,
be like, a way to sequester like these contaminants within
mm.
the organism itself. Um, because again, like the whole process of like trying to get rid of the plants and trying to find a way um, for that ending part of the circle, right? Of like what
Mm.
we're doing with phytoremediation is still very experimental, I would say. So that's like one of the ideas I had in mind. What do you think?
So I'm a Capricorn and I like goats. And so I I'm
I'm a
not a fan.
Capricorn too, so
Yeah. I'm just like, ooh. I mean, if it was me, I wouldn't do that just because I'm like, I don't want to subject these animals. Like they didn't sign up for this. Like I don't want to subject them to that. And
yeah,
things like lead are like they're a neurotoxin, you know?
yeah.
So I personally wouldn't do that. I would only do that in a situation where I'd, pulled out as much as I can and then immobilized the rest enough that I feel like there's not a lot getting into what the goat would be foraging personally. But
Mhm.
I wouldn't do it. I mean, I mean, that is, depending on how you feel about animals and stuff, that's something that could be done. But I just think it's like that's a lot of extra steps. And it's a being that like hasn't consented to that. I think we have to think about that. It's
Yeah.
part of that do no harm thing, right? Where I mean, we as humans don't want to eat from those sites. Why would we ask a goat? But I will say, like, there's a lot of interesting thinking with that. And I don't understand enough about like that piece you were talking about. Like, if you feed it good stuff, will it absorb the same? Like, you know what I mean? Can that counteract some of the bad? I don't know that answer. And so I think that's
Mhm.
an interesting thing to look into, if there's a way to, yeah, like I
From
think it,
from what I've looked
yeah,
into specifically with lead, is that
yeah,
when you have a higher antioxidant diet as well as it being paired with like a high calcium diet as well, it can help mitigate like a lot of the antioxidant responses, like help with the neurotoxic aspects,
yeah.
and then the high calcium helps replace um what lead would be absorbed into the actual bones. But I guess it kind of
Yeah.
depends like what we want the final outcome to be. Like, do we want like a majority of that lead to go back into the manure? Do we want it to go to the bones? Probably, it's like different things to
Mm,
consider
hmm.
how we would, I guess, feed the diet to the goat. But anyway,
Yeah.
this is
And then
like,
you end up with it's moved in a different form, right?
mhm.
So yeah, that is like something to ruminate on for the next few classes.
Okay,
But yeah, thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you for sharing that. I think we will wrap it up just because it is we're about 18 minutes, 20 minutes over time. But I want to thank y'all for like that was a really great kind of set of questions, conversations, people sharing some of the amazing work they're doing. So thank you. And I know for folks who are on the East Coast, it's really late right now. So thank you for kind of sticking it out. Uh, we'll be here next week, same time, same place, and we're going to focus on mushrooms next week. And one thing I'll say about this course is we're going to be learning, you can already hear how like some of these things overlap, right? And we're already starting to talk a bit about bacteria, and there's a whole part of plants and fungi that we haven't talked about that'll become more apparent next class in terms of how they help each other do the work. And so after the first three classes, we get more into the territory of like, how do we combine microbes, plants, fungi? How do we sequence it? How do we work and have everything work together? So we're just starting with things individually. And so we'll continue building next week with fungi And so come with your micromediation questions. Danielle Stevenson is going to be speaking, and she is a wealth of knowledge and has been doing really cool work, both in terms of mycophytoremediation of brownfields, as well as even looking at plastics and microremediation and post-wildfire work down in Los Angeles. So I hope you guys can take that all in, and I will see you next week. And again, join the Mighty Network. If I didn't answer a question that you had, please feel free to post it there and I will try to answer it, or we'll get to it next time. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.